Our last speaker of this session, and presumably of the last, talk on the substance of this workshop, is Nicola Santoro from Carleton University about the Copen-Robert problems in the periodic temporal case. And please.
Thank you for inviting me to this workshop. It's very interesting to see all the different aspects of computing with time in graphs. My talk is about a very specific problem, and I'll introduce it. And typically, I'm talking about temporal graphs, and when I mean temporal graphs, I mean a special case of a special subclass of time-varying graphs, those in which the time is not continuous, but discrete. So we have time discrete, and there are many representations for temporal graphs with discrete time. And one that I will be using and rather common is that the graph is represented as an infinite sequence, possibly infinite sequence of graphs, of static graphs. And this is not new definition. I mean, this has been going on for 25 years, a quarter century, and is due to Frank Harari, the famous graph theorist. And now, just in terms of terminology, each one of these graphs in the sequence is called the snapshot, and the aggregate graph is called the footprint. Bit more terminology is this notion, the one I'm going to be using is the one of a journey, of a strict journey. It essentially is like a temporal walk, but there is no waiting. I mean, you have to go from one to the next. So if you are at here, if you go to 2, then immediately there must move from 2. And still, the other concept is the one which is important for us, is the one of connectivity. And the typical things that is done is essentially the minimal assumptions that you can make on connectivity on these infinite sequences is that it's temporally connected. That means that at any point in time, there is a strict journey that goes from one to any other node. And one which is especially in distributed computing is assumption instead with use is a much more powerful restricted one where you ask with each one of these snapshots, each one of these graphs is connected. And what I'm interested in actually is about periodic ones. In periodic ones, because they repeat itself, the sequence has a much shorter representation in terms of the period. And what I'm interested in, where I come from, is distributed computing, and here in particular by computation of mobile entities on graphs. The mobile entities, usually they are called agents. So we have these entities, computational agents, that can move from node to node. And typically in all the literature, they assume that they have the same behavior, all these agents have the same behavior, and they collaborate. They collaborate to solve a problem, to perform a task. Typical task is the search, they need to gather. And now, if we look in terms of temporal graphs, obviously, I mean, this is exactly the same, only that where they, at each time unit in each round, is always the same graph. The graph doesn't change. And when we move to temporal, the only thing that changes in this setting is the fact that the graph might change at any time. Notice that implicit in this definition is just in the fact of the temporal thing. It's the fact that the network, the entire system of composed of the agents on this temporal graph is synchronous. Now, they are collaborative, and people have been working. There is lots of work being done on doing this, but the question I'm asking now is instead, what happens if they do not collaborate? If these agents, for example, they have a totally conflicting behavior, they might be enemies. They can have goals which are antagonistic. And this is the case, for example, in pursue evasion. And one of the most popular pursue evasion is clearly the cops and robbers. It's a pursue evasion which two set of players, and is played in rounds in a graph. And the one I'm gonna be talking today, focusing is just on the cop, at least for now. So we have a cop and we have a robber, and there are many ways of many formulations or variations of this game. It's what we shall call the standard one. The standard one is played on a undirected connected graph, and initially you have the cop and then the robber. They choose a location. Then once this is done in every single round, now first the cop and then the robber move. They're actually allowed to stay on things. We can represent the fact that they remove the staying and making them move by adding self-loops to the node. So what is the goal of the cop? The goal of the cop is to capture the robber, and you capture the robber when you end up in the same place as the robber is. And the goal of the robber is avoiding being captured. So let's now play this on a temporal graph. In a temporal graph, what happens is like before only, but now the graph changes may change at every time step. And now, if we look at each snapshot, is undirected and reflexive like in the standard game, but doesn't need to be connected. That's a very strong assumption. In fact, what we need is the minimal assumptions that the temporal graph is temporally connected. And the question is, well, I give you a temporal graph, this infinite sequence, and I ask you, is this coupling? What does it mean coupling? Means there is an initial placement and the strategy of the couplet always will capture the robber. And obviously the same question is asked on if it's periodic, which is, it's just repeat itself periodically, the sequence. Now, it's interesting, this question is actually being studied in the pioneering work by Erlerbach and Spooner, where they found a solution. And the solution was done through transformation of this cop and robber games into a reachability game. And they managed to answer then this in a time complexity of n cubed, where n is the number of vertices, and p is the times p, where p is the period. The only problem is that since it's an automatic transformation, this solution does not really provide insight on the nature of the cop and robber games inside in a temporal setting. That's what we try to do. I should mention that this is actually ongoing work, and nothing is published yet for this. Okay, so the first thing to observe is that, we have this periodic graph, but any periodic graph can be represented as a single directed static graph, which in this case we call it arena. It's a particular type of static directed graph, which is a multi-stage. Let me explain how this is done. Essentially, if you take any snapshot, like any one of those graphs in the sequence, each one of them corresponds a piece, a stage, or a slice of this arena. And we call them temporal nodes. So for each vertex, really there is two of them. There is the one at I, that's one where I is the time of the snapshot. So for each edge, since it's directed, there are two edges because I can go from D to C and from C to D. They are inside the and since it's reflexive, I will not draw the self loops, but since it's reflexive, I can stay in the same node. And finally, one thing that is a node is called universal if it's connected to everybody else, his slice is full if every node is universal, which means the snapshot is really a click. Okay, now let's skip this for the moment. And let's go to this notion of configuration and the coupling. So what is a configuration? The configuration is just simply a triplet where it says a time t, and then gives you the position of the cup and the position of the robot. And a configuration for a given configuration is said to be coupling if it's starting in this configuration. So if at time t, the cup is at x and the robot is at y, the cup will win. The strategy will win regardless of what the robot does. So there is a winning strategy for the cup. Now this is important, and it's just a definition. But let's see the first consequence of this definition. Here there is an edge inside a snapshot in one of those terms. So if there is an edge and happens, and the cup is at A and the robber is at B, well, and at that time, well, if the cup goes to B, it wins because it captures. So what does it mean? This means that the configuration at time t, the cup at A, B, is cup win. This situation, it corresponds inside the arena to this type of edge here. So what is the consequence of this fact? Well, the consequence of this fact is an observation that every edge of the arena corresponds to a coupling configuration. So for it, we have the arena, we have the edges in the arena. Every single edge corresponds to a coupling configuration. This is good. And now we go on the very first interesting concept of augmented or shadow arena. Okay, what is an augmented arena? Augmented arena essentially is a superset of the original arena. Remember, the arena is, this is the original arena. This is practically the graph, the periodic graph, and it's a superset and has a special, where all the edges that exist there are important because each one of them is a coupling configuration, corresponds to a coupling configuration. We already know that this is true for the original arena, but we can have other edges. And so we can have more edges to the original arena, which we can call like the shadow edges, and each one of them has a meaning, it's a coupling configuration. Now, one interesting thing is that the set of the augmented arenas is closed under the union of set edges. So if I take two arenas and make the union, two augmented arenas of the same arena, and I make the union of the edges, this is also an augmented arena. And therefore, if it's closed, there is a maximum. Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because there is one more interesting, important the determination property. Because an arena is coupling if and only if the maximum augmented is coupling. So that means a periodic temporal graph is coupling if and only if its maximum augmented is coupling. Now, let's use this fact. Using this fact, now we have a notion of shadow corner. Now, I don't know if those of you who are familiar with the game like Combat Robbers. I was not. I learned it. I found out that a crucial concept is the notion in the static case is the notion of a corner. Well, an equally important place in the temporal setting is played by this notion of shadow corners. What is a shadow corner? Well, the shadow corner is a node, here U, and for which there exists another node, V, such that, which is called the cover. And essentially what happens is that if I look at all the places where you can go, all the neighbors you can go, and inside the original arena, and I look all the places where V can go in the augmented array, then this is actually scored. What does this mean? This means this is very important because this means that, for example, if the cop is here, the robber is here and the cop is there, wherever is the turn of U to move, okay, wherever this moves, in the next time the cop will be. Okay. And this gives us the augmentation property, which is one of the important properties, which says if I have a corner, a shadow corner, this is a corner of this guy will cover it completely. Then if there exists some neighbor of of this cover, which is not a neighbor, this one, then I can actually, if I add this edge to the augmented array, I still keep an augmented array. Now, why all of this is important? Because this actually is giving us a solution strategy. Says, what is the solution? So how do we find out if it's a temporal, the temporal graph is a coupling? Well, you start with an augmented array. Then you find one of these shadow corners that satisfy the augmentation. You add the new edge, and you keep on doing this until it's maximum. Once you find the maximum, we know that that is coupling if and only if the maximum is full. Otherwise, it's robbery. There are a couple of problems with this. The first problem is that every time you add a new shadow edge, you might create new shadow corners. So, it's a process that keep on going, and up to a point, obviously. And now the other thing, which is even more important and strange, is the fact that difficult is how do you know that you reach the maximum? Okay, if it's full, definitely, if you reach one which is full, you know that you're done. But if it's not full, you don't know whether it's a robber win or you still have to keep on going. And fortunately, there is another property that we discovered is that essentially it just says that if you are in the if you are in an augmented arena, but you don't know, you are not it's not the maximum one, then there exists, you can find it. And how do you find it? One which is missing. You can still keep on going. How do you find it? Well, how you find this actually comes from the proof that says that there exists one. Because if it's not maximum, there exists some edge. We know that there exists some edge, which is in the maximum, but not yet in this one. But the fact that it is in the maximum means that the configuration, remember, every edge of an augmented arena corresponds to a coupling configuration. That means this is coupling. That means there exists some winning strategy of the coupling. And now we move in the universe of of the configuration space induced by this. So I would like just to show, just to explain the things. So we are in this configuration. This one is the one which we know is not there. Now, what does this mean? This means this is coupling. So what does it mean? It means that if time t is coupling, the cop is here, the robber is here. This means that if I had this is the winning strategy, and the winning strategy for me, the cop says go to Z. Okay, fine, I'll go to Z. And this choice is made such that this is a winning strategy, regardless of where the robber can move from Y, will end up in again coupling configuration. And for example, if the robber moves to YI, well, I'm going here. I end up in this configuration. situation. And here I say, well, I'm in Z, this guy is in I. What is my strategy to win? It says go to W, and then go to W. And W is such that regardless where the rubber will move from there, it's still a COP win. And now eventually, for each one, since it's a COP win strategy, the COP will win. That means I end up in exactly the same place. Now, so starting from here, which is where we are at time t, and I'm not with the COP is at x and the rubber is at y, I have this acyclic directed, representing the configuration space where I end up. In some places I win directly. Where I don't win, I keep, it's my strategy tells me where to go. So now, this, if I look at one of these points in the strategy, what happens is that this edge here is definitely in the plane, but it could be in my augmented area or not. And I will find, and I will show in here are the ones where I'm not in mine. So there's then a shadow edges is missing. This is no shadow edges is missing. And we focus on, I'm sorry, just 1 second. We focus on one that exists. We know that there exists one where shadow edges is missing, where everybody else where I can reach for from instead is not missing a shadow edge. So I'm focusing now on this. And what happens is no shadow edges. Here there is some shadow edge. This edge is missing. So what does it mean? It means that in the arena, this is U, this is V, this edge is missing. On the other hand, all the edges from W to this are not missing. But this is exactly the definition of the shadow code. It means that if this edge is missing, I can add it. It means that's how I can find what to add. Essentially, what I do it backward, I start from the leaves and I can move until I find this one. Then I move. So, solution strategy is to find an augmentation property, start with an augmented arena, and because of the augmentation property, I can keep adding, and I can tell whether I reach the end. And once I reach the end, I can tell if we stop playing or not. Now, this part is by no means trivial. It's rather complicated. And still, what we have an algorithm which is based on this solution strategy. And it provides actually a winning solution strategy. Also, the interesting thing is that it does so in time n times m, where n is the sum of all the edges in all the periodic graphs. So, for example, if the graph is sparse, this is the improvement to this. Now, one interesting thing is that this approach I showed for the standard COP and robots, it can be actually same approach. So this other variant, which are the directed, fully active, the mix. But the most interesting thing, it can be generalized to more than one COP. And some properties, is even more interesting, can be done to other types of temporal types. That means not just the periodic one, can be done to the aperiodic ones, to the general. So what this does is just introducing some useful concepts. One of augmented arena, giving some insight on what happens to the game when you play it in a temporal setting, and gives also improved bounds. But all of this should be seen as just the first step in a study on the pursuit of Asian games on temporal. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Let's thank the speaker. Okay, we have a question here in the audience. Yes, please. No, we actually lost it. You can come here. Well, or you can say, and I will repeat.
You talked about that so first of all, did I understand it correctly that the improvement over the Algorithmic approach is basically that you don't need to consider the position of the cop and the rubber as a factor in your running time?
So the first question, if I understood correctly, is the improvement over the previous algorithm is that there is no need to consider the position of the cop and the robber as what?
As a factor in running time.
Well, yeah, the separate factor which is in the product for the running time.
Yes. I mean, in both cases. I mean, it's in the running time. In the worst case, it's still the same. It's still, n cube p, but it's order on p. But in general, it's clearly an improvement.
And you said that your approach can be generalized. So what would be the running time for, let's say, a K-pop?
The question is, what would be the running time for K-pops?
Okay. So now, as I mentioned during the talk, I mean, this is ongoing unpublished work. We are still refining all this. It's a similar improvement. Obviously there is still now the number of pops k it comes into place, right? Come into place both in the exponent and as a multiplicative constant. But we still don't. Hopefully, it's going to appear soon. We're going to finish and appear soon.
Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
So Nicola, in the static graphs, there is this all this theory of Cobb-Winn graphs, which are characterized if there is a let's say reverse vertex elimination ordering, and if you have a vertex whose set of neighbors is subset of the set of neighbors of another vertex, then this is in the ordering after that, and you can take it out. And if there is a graph satisfying that, then it's Cobb-Winn.
Yes.
I think this relates, doesn't it? It relates to your approach somehow.
Yes, in fact, actually, that's what we were trying to do. Originally, we were trying to find the equivalent of the dismantling. I mean, this temporal covers. In the original, in the static case, you dismantle it and you have an order of dismantling it. In here, turns out that in the temporal case, I mean, what turns out that we have this similar notion of this, what we call the shadow corner. But in a sense, in order to determine them, in order to remove them, we first have to add. So we have the augmented edges. We add edges and we can remove from consideration. I mean, the part with SA is non-trivial in the algorithm. It includes, lots and lots of details of this type. But yes, it is. We cannot call it dismantling it because it's not really dismantled, but it is based on a similar concept on this function of these corners. They're crucial.
Any more questions? Okay, yeah, okay. I have actually a question that you have this period and you have this, you have the algorithm for determining who wins in the game. And if the cop wins, how long can it actually take in terms of size of the graph and the period? Can it take longer than, say, NP?
I don't know. We have not considered that at the time yet. I mean, there is an obvious upper bound on the time, but it's not. I mean, we one of the questions we wanted to examine is the time. You see, right now, for example, every time you can figure out the strategy. I mean, the COP-WIN strategy, and when determining the COP-WIN strategy, you can also try to minimize the time. But there is, I don't know. We still don't have any reasonable bound on the.
What's the obvious upper bound you name? You said there is an obvious upper bound. What is the obvious one? And quadratic m squared p?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yes, I don't know exactly.
Yes. Thank you. Any other question? Okay, if there are no more questions, then let's thank the speaker again.